The evening smelled like money. That was the first thing anyone noticed about the Harrington Club. Not the chandeliers dripping with crystal, not the waiters in their pressed white jackets moving between tables like ghosts, not even the view of Lake Michigan stretching, dark and endless beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. It was the smell. Wool and cedar, and something faintly floral, expensive in a way that didn't announce itself. The kind of place where a single dinner cost more than most people's rent, and nobody at the tables ever looked at the menu prices. Edmund Callister sat at the corner table he always reserved. 54 years old, silver at his temples in that way that looks distinguished rather than tired, his suit a deep charcoal that had been tailored to him specifically. He was the kind of man Chicago knew. Not famous exactly, he didn't need to be. He ran Callister Capital, one of the oldest private equity firms in the Midwest, and the kind of people who mattered knew his name without being told twice. Tonight he was waiting for Simone. She was 20 minutes late, which she always was, and he didn't mind, which he always didn't. That was the rhythm of what they were. He turned his water glass slowly in his fingers and looked out at the lake and thought, not for the first time, that he was lucky. Lucky in ways he'd spent most of his life being too busy to notice. His phone buzzed, a text from his business partner, Owen, asking about the Meridian deal. He turned the phone face down. Not tonight. The waiter brought a bread basket, and Edmund broke a piece without looking at it, still watching the lake. A boat moved somewhere out there, a distant white light cutting across the black water. He thought about his daughter, Isabel, who was in Boston, now finishing her residency, and never had enough time to call. He thought about the house in Evanston that had felt too large since his divorce 4 years ago. He thought about how strange it was to be this successful and still eat dinner alone on most Tuesdays. Then something small moved at the edge of his vision. He almost didn't see it. A shadow near the service corridor, the narrow hallway that connected the kitchen to the dining room, the one the waiters used when they needed to move quickly and invisibly. Edmund had eaten at the Harrington Club so many times over the years that he knew its geometry by heart. That corridor wasn't somewhere guests went. The shadow moved again. A child. A boy maybe 10 or 11, painfully thin, wearing a hoodie 2 sizes too large, and sneakers with a sole coming loose at the toe. He was pressed against the wall just inside the corridor, barely visible in the low light, watching the dining room with enormous dark eyes. Not curious eyes, careful ones. Edmund blinked. The boy was gone. He told himself he'd imagined it. He picked up the bread again, and then the boy appeared at his elbow, so quietly that Edmund startled and knocked his water glass, catching it before it tipped. "Sir," the boy said, very quietly, "don't eat the lamb." Edmund stared at him. He was maybe 11, close up, dark-haired, slight, with the particular look of a child who had been hungry long enough that it had become a permanent condition. Hollows under his cheekbones, wrists like twigs inside the 2 big sleeves. His eyes were steady, though, not frightened, something in them that was older than his face. "Excuse me?" Edmund said. "The lamb," the boy said again. "They're bringing it to your table. Don't eat it." Edmund looked around automatically for a waiter, for someone who might claim this child, might explain what he was doing in one of the most exclusive restaurants in the city, in a worn-out hoodie at 8 o'clock on a Thursday night. No one was looking their way. "Son," Edmund said carefully, "who are you?" The boy hesitated. His eyes cut toward the service corridor, then back. "My name's Kit," he said. "Please, I heard them in the kitchen. There's something wrong with the lamb." "Wrong how?" But Kit had already pulled back, already moving toward the corridor. He glanced over his shoulder once, those careful eyes landing on Edmund's white face. "Just don't eat it," he said, and then he was gone. Edmund sat very still for a long moment. A different man might have called over the maitre d' immediately, might have made a scene, might have laughed it off and ordered anyway. Edmund Callister had not built 30 years of business by dismissing things that felt wrong. He had a particular talent. His ex-wife used to call it paranoia. His lawyers called it due diligence, for paying attention to small details that other people waved away. He sat. He waited. Simone arrived 6 minutes later in a cloud of Chanel No. 5 and apologies, her dark coat beaded with November rain, her smile the one that had made him trust her in the first place, warm and uncomplicated and real. Or what he'd believed was real. She kissed his cheek, sat across from him, reached for the bread and said, "I ordered for us both. Hope that's okay. I knew you'd want the lamb." Edmund looked at her. "You ordered," he said, "before you arrived?" "I called ahead." She smiled, unfolding her napkin. "You always get the lamb." He had ordered the lamb every time he'd eaten here for 4 years. She knew that. Everyone who knew him at this restaurant knew that. He picked up his menu. "Actually," he said, keeping his voice light, "I'm thinking the halibut tonight." Something moved across her face, so fast he would have missed it if he hadn't been watching carefully. A tightening, there and gone, replaced immediately by the easy smile. "Oh," she said. "Of course." The lamb arrived anyway. The waiter set it in front of Edmund's place because that was what had been called in. Edmund told him to take it away. He watched Simone's fingers tighten almost imperceptibly on the stem of her wine glass. They ate. They talked. She was charming. She always was. Afterward, while Simone was in the powder room, Edmund slipped the maitre $200 in cash and asked a very specific question. Had anything unusual happened in the kitchen that evening? The maitre, a man named Philippe who had known Edmund for 15 years, took the money and looked at him with an expression that said he understood. This was not a casual question. "I'll look into it quietly," Philippe said. Edmund nodded. He put his phone in his pocket and went back to the table. Kit had been living in the utility space behind the Harrington Club for 11 days. Before that, he'd been at the shelter on West Madison, but they'd lost his paperwork and there hadn't been a bed, and he was 11 years old and knew enough by now not to wait around for systems that couldn't see him to suddenly notice he existed. He'd found the utility space by accident, a door that didn't latch properly on the side of the building, a room stacked with extra chairs and folded linen, and a boiler that made the whole space warm even in November. He'd set up in the corner behind the linen shelves. He had a sleeping bag, a backpack with 2 changes of clothes, and a library book he'd already read 4 times, and $37 in cash from returnable cans and odd jobs. He knew the layout of the back of the building by heart. He knew when the deliveries came, which staff members took smoke breaks, and which entrance the dishwashers used, and how to stay invisible in a place that was built to serve people who never wondered what happened behind the walls. He'd been invisible his whole life, more or less. His mother had died of a stroke when he was 8. She'd been 31 years old and healthy as far as anyone knew. And then one morning she was on the kitchen floor, and Kit had called 911 and held her hand until the paramedics came, and she never woke up. His father had been gone since before Kit was old enough to remember a face. There'd been a grandmother in Indiana, and then the grandmother had gotten too sick to care for a child, and then there'd been a series of foster placements that he had survived in the way that water survives, by moving around the obstacles rather than through them. The last placement had ended 6 weeks ago when the couple lost their license, and Kit had spent a week in an emergency group home and then simply walked out one night because the group home had felt less safe than nowhere. He wasn't angry about any of it. That was the thing about Kit that most adults who noticed him for half a second found either admirable or unsettling. He had an equanimity about his life that didn't seem earned so much as constitutional. He'd been this way as long as he could remember, patient, watchful, accepting of facts without being defeated by them. The fact right now was that a woman had paid a cook to put something in a man's food. Kit had been behind the linen shelf in the utility room when the cook, not the head chef, one of the line cooks, a young man in checked pants who always looked nervous, had come in to take a call. Kit had been very still. The cook had paced and spoken in a low, urgent voice, and Kit had understood enough to understand plenty. The woman's name was Simone. The man was her boyfriend. The cook had been given money. The lamb was the dish she'd called ahead for. Kit had thought about this for a long time before he did anything. He'd thought about who would believe him and who wouldn't. He'd thought about what happened if he walked up to the dining room and a waiter saw him and called the police. He'd thought about all the times in his life he'd reported something to an adult and been told he must have misunderstood. Then he'd thought about the man eating poisoned food. He couldn't not tell him, so he had. And the man had listened, had really listened, in a way that surprised Kit, who was used to being looked through, and the man had not eaten the lamb. Kit went back to his corner behind the linen shelves and pulled his sleeping bag around his shoulders and thought that was probably the end of it. He was wrong. Edmund spent the next 3 days doing the thing he did best, which was following a thread very carefully and very quietly until he understood exactly what was on the other end. Philippe had called him Friday morning. The line cook had resigned that same night, called in after his shift, and quit by voicemail, which Philippe found strange. Edmund found it confirming. He had a security consultant he used for certain matters, a woman named Greer, former federal investigator, now private, and he called her Friday afternoon and gave her Simone's name and asked her to look into the business arrangements. What Greer found took until Sunday. Simone de Vries had been introduced to Edmund 14 months ago through a mutual acquaintance at a charity gala. She was a wealth management advisor. Her credentials looked perfect. Her references had checked out, and Edmund, who had been careful his entire life, had allowed himself to stop being careful about this one thing, because he'd been lonely and she'd been kind, and he was 54 years old and human. What Greer found was that Simone had a history. 2 prior relationships with wealthy men, both ending with the men losing significant investments through what looked like bad advice and was, on closer examination, something considerably more deliberate. One of those men had experienced a health crisis 18 months into the relationship. The matter had been settled out of court and was behind a very thorough NDA. Edmund read Greer's report sitting at his kitchen table at 11 o'clock on a Sunday night and felt the specific cold clarity that came to him when he finally saw the full shape of something he'd been sensing only pieces of. He called his attorney. Then he sat in his too-large house in Evanston and thought about a boy with careful eyes in a worn-out hoodie. He had not been able to find Kit. He'd asked Philippe, who had asked the staff. No one admitted to knowing how a child had gotten into the building. Edmund had walked the exterior twice and found the unlatched utility door on the second pass. He'd opened it and found a room full of chairs and linen and a boiler, and in the corner a sleeping bag. It was empty, but it was there. Edmund sat down on a folded chair and looked at the sleeping bag for a long time. It was Greer who found Kit, eventually. She was good at finding things. He was at the public library on Michigan Avenue, in the reading room on the 3rd floor, sitting in an armchair much too large for him with a book open in his lap. When Edmund came in and sat in the chair beside him, Kit looked up with the expression of someone who had been half expecting this and had decided not to run. "You're the man from the restaurant," Kit said. "Edmund Callister," Edmund said. "And you're Kit." Edmund looked at the book, a library copy of The Count of Monte Cristo, dog-eared and worn. "How long have you been in that utility room?" he asked. Kit considered whether to lie. 11 days, he said. Before that, the shelter on Madison, and before that, a pause, group home, another pause. Foster placement. Edmund nodded slowly. He had prepared questions. Logical, reasonable questions about Kit's situation, about contacts and caseworkers and systems and options. He'd talked to a family attorney before coming here. He had a plan, orderly and researched, the way he approached everything. What came out instead was, "Are you hungry?" Kit looked at him. "Yeah," the boy said quietly. "Pretty hungry." They went to a diner 2 blocks over, the ordinary kind, counter seats and laminated menus and coffee that came in ceramic mugs. Kit ordered pancakes and eggs and ate with the focused seriousness of a child who doesn't know when the next meal is coming. Edmund drank his coffee and didn't push. He'd learned a long time ago that rushing a conversation was the best way to lose it. When Kit had eaten most of the pancakes, he said without looking up, "Did she try to poison you?" "She arranged for something to be put in my food," Edmund said. "Yes." Kit nodded. He seemed to have already filed this under things he understood about the world. "Why did you warn me?" Edmund asked. Kit set his fork down and thought about this with the same seriousness he brought to everything. "Because I couldn't not," he said finally. It wasn't a performance of virtue. It was just the truth, stated plainly, the way he seemed to state everything. Edmund looked at this boy, this 11-year-old, who had been navigating the world alone with $37 and a library book and a sleeping bag in a utility room, who had weighed the risks and done the right thing anyway. And something in his chest did something it hadn't done in a long time. "I want to help," Edmund said. "If you'll let me." Kit looked up at him. Those careful eyes were steady. "Grown-ups say that," he said, not unkindly. "I know," Edmund said. "I'm going to say it anyway. It wasn't easy. Nothing about it was easy. The systems that were supposed to protect children like Kit were overwhelmed and underfunded, and moved at the speed of a river in winter. and Edmund quickly learned that having money and connections made things faster, but did not make them simple. There were caseworkers and hearings and home studies and background checks, and a great deal of paperwork. And there were weeks where it seemed like every step forward revealed two more obstacles. And there was one particular Tuesday in February when Edmund sat in an attorney's office and was told that the process could take another 8 to 12 months and felt, for the first time, genuinely afraid that it wouldn't happen. He drove home through the February sleet and called his daughter in Boston. Isabel answered on the third ring, her voice carrying the distracted edge of a second-year resident who hadn't slept properly in 5 days. "Dad, what's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," he said. "And then, because he was not practiced at this, I met someone." A pause. "Dad, if you're calling me about Simone again, I already told you the restraining order." "Not Simone. A kid." He paused at a red light. "A boy. His name is Kit." There was a longer silence on the other end of the line, and when Isabel spoke again, her voice had changed, the distraction gone. "Tell me," she said. So he told her. The restaurant, the hoodie, the careful eyes, the sleeping bag behind the linen shelves, the pancakes, the 8 months of legal process since. She listened without interrupting, which wasn't like her usually, and when he finished she was quiet for a moment. "How old is he?" she said. 11. 12 in March. "And he's been staying with you since October." "In the guest room. There are rules about what that means legally during the process. He has a caseworker who visits. It's all documented, Dad." Her voice was soft now. "Is he okay?" Edmund thought about Kit at the kitchen table, doing homework with the same focused seriousness he brought to everything. Kit discovering that Edmund had a chess set in the study and proceeding to beat him 6 games out of 8. Kit, standing at the kitchen window on a Saturday morning, looking at the snow in the backyard with an expression Edmund had needed 3 weeks to identify, because it wasn't something he'd seen on a child's face before. It was the expression of someone learning, very slowly and very carefully, to believe that a good thing might not be taken away. "He's getting there," Edmund said. March arrived gray and slushy, and on the 14th, the day Kit turned 12, Edmund made him a chocolate cake from a recipe he'd found in an old cookbook his own mother had left behind, and that had lived in a cabinet for 15 years, mostly unused. The cake was lopsided. The frosting was applied with more enthusiasm than skill. Edmund, who had negotiated billion-dollar deals without showing nerves, felt genuinely anxious watching Kit come into the kitchen and see it. Kit stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the cake on the counter. Then he looked at Edmund. "You made that," he said. "I tried," Edmund said. "The frosting isn't—" "You made that," Kit said again, quieter this time, like it was a fact that needed to be looked at from more than one angle. Edmund didn't say anything. Kit walked over and sat on the kitchen stool and looked at the cake for a moment. "I haven't had a birthday cake," he said, "in a really long time." His voice was matter-of-fact. That was Kit's way. He said hard things in a plain voice because the plain voice was armor, and it was dignity, and it was the only style of bravery available to someone who'd had to be brave very young. Edmund sat across from him. "Well," he said, "you're having one now." They ate the cake at the kitchen counter, just the two of them, and it was too sweet and the layers were uneven, and it was the best thing Edmund had made in years. In April, Simone DeVries entered a plea agreement. The line cook, cooperating with the DA's office in exchange for reduced charges, had provided a detailed account of what he'd been paid to do and by whom. 2 additional individuals, associates of Simone's connected to the cases Greer had uncovered, were charged separately. Edmund didn't go to the courthouse. He didn't need to watch it. He already knew what it was. He was in the backyard with Kit when his attorney called with the news, teaching the boy to throw a proper spiral with the old football that had been in the garage since Isabel was in high school. Kit could not throw a spiral. He could not yet throw a spiral. He was committed to the project with his characteristic seriousness, studying Edmund's grip, asking precise questions, correcting his own form with a methodical patience. Edmund took the call, said a few words, ended it. "Good news?" Kit asked, holding the football with both hands. "Loose ends being tied up," Edmund said. Kit nodded. He seemed to understand this was about the woman from the restaurant, and that it was resolved, and that he didn't need the details. He looked at the football in his hands. "Show me the grip again," he said. The finalization came in June. The courtroom was small and wood-paneled and felt, Edmund thought, oddly ordinary for the room where this particular thing was happening. His attorney was there, and the caseworker, and Isabel, who had flown in from Boston in a clear act of prioritization that had made Edmund have to look at the ceiling briefly when she'd walked in. Kit sat beside Edmund in a blue button-down shirt he'd bought himself with his own money, which he'd earned doing odd jobs in the neighborhood with a gravity that suggested he took financial independence seriously. He was straight-backed and composed, and when the judge spoke to him directly, asking him if he understood what today meant, Kit said yes in a voice that was steady. The judge signed the papers. Edmund's attorney shook his hand. The caseworker, a woman named Patel, who had been doing this job for 20 years, and whose default expression was professionally neutral, smiled. And then Isabel crouched down in front of Kit with her hands on his shoulders and said, "Welcome to the most annoying family in Evanston," in such a dry deadpan that Kit startled into a laugh, an actual laugh, unguarded and real, the kind Edmund had been hearing more of in the past few weeks and still felt, each time, like something rare and valuable. They went to lunch after. Isabel and Kit argued about whether pineapple belonged on pizza with a vehemence that suggested they were going to get along just fine. Edmund sat across the table from them and drank his coffee and watched his daughter and his son, and the thought arrived simply and without ceremony. His son. He let it sit there. He let it be true. That night, after Isabel had headed back to her hotel and the house was quiet, Edmund found Kit in the study. He was in the big leather chair that was too large for him, reading The Count of Monte Cristo, a new copy now, his own, purchased in February when Edmund had noticed him reading the worn library edition for a 5th time. He had a lamp on beside him and his socked feet tucked up underneath him, and he looked like a boy who was entirely at home. He looked up when Edmund came in. "Hey," Kit said. "Hey," Edmund said. He leaned against the doorframe. "Good day?" Kit thought about it with the same seriousness he gave every question. "Yeah," he said. "Really good day." Edmund nodded. He started to head to bed, and then Kit said, not looking up from the book, "Edmund, yeah?" A pause. Small and careful, like a door opening slowly. "Can I call you Dad?" Edmund stood very still in the doorway. He thought about the utility room behind a restaurant, a sleeping bag in the corner, a boy with careful eyes who had weighed the cost and warned a stranger anyway, because he couldn't not. He thought about chocolate cake with lopsided frosting and a football in a gray April backyard and a laugh surprised out of a 12-year-old in a courthouse hallway. He thought about all the years he'd sat in this house with the lights on and the rooms empty and told himself that was what his life looked like now, and that it was fine, and that it was enough. He looked at his son. "Yeah," Edmund said, "you can." Kit nodded once, the way he nodded at facts. Then he looked back at his book, and his mouth curved up at the corner in a small, quiet smile that he didn't bother to hide. Edmund turned off the hall light and went to bed, and for the first time in a long time the house didn't feel too large at all.